I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker, DeRay Mckesson. Along with his colleagues on Pod Save the People, DeRay creates a weekly space that promotes engagement on some of the most pressing issues facing our society. These include gun violence, mass incarceration, overwhelming police violence against minorities, and as a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and a co-founder of organizations such as jointcampaignzero.org and ourstates.org, DeRay works to ensure that we all are equipped to be the most impactful citizen, I can't think of the word, activists, there you go, that we could possibly be. So please everybody, can we welcome DeRay Mckesson.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. It is almost 5 years since the protest in St. Louis. Can we take this slide off? Can we just take no slides right now? Thank you. It's almost 5 years since the protest in St. Louis. People forget that we were in the street for 400 days. You know, a lot of people look back and they think about it as a long weekend, but it was a long 400 days. People also forget that it was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014. If you ever saw us marching in the street, it wasn't that we thought marching was cool or the most effective strategy. It was illegal to stand still for more than 5 seconds. I say that because I've thought a lot about what I've learned in the past 5 years, and I want to talk about 4 sort of big lessons in organizing that I learned in the past 4 years. I'll start with my time as a teacher. I used to teach 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn. 6th grade is by far the best grade. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant, and it is rough. But 6th grade is a lot of joy. 7th graders, they fart and they burp, and you're like, 6th grade is still a lot of magic and a lot of joy. And I taught 60, 90, and 120-minute classes, which is a lot for an 11-year-old to do math. It's a lot for anybody to do math. And one day I had this 120-minute class, and my students were like, can we go to gym early? Gym teacher's my best friend in the world. He also was a science teacher, so gym was a little special. But I let them go, and they came back really quick, and I was like, why are you back so soon? And what I realized that they were in love with the idea of gym more than the work of gym. And I say that because in this moment, I think people are more in love with the idea of resistance than the work of resistance. So I want to figure out how we talk about the work a little better. The first thing that I'm always mindful of is this notion that we never let the system off the hook, that we always fight at the system level. I'll ask you to do something with the person next to you, with an elbow partner. If you can tell somebody next to you something you can buy for $300, so really do it. Tell them something you can buy for $300. Actually do it. Something you can buy for $300. I love your glasses. They're great. Actually do it. $300 or $300. Okay, bring it back in 5, 4, 3, 2. We'll do this side. If somebody over in the corner area-ish, if you can yell out something you can buy for $300. KitchenAid mixer, okay. Over here. Textbook, what? Airline tickets, over here. Okay. A wall hanging that's fair trade. Over here? Past due loan payment. Over here? A lot of pizza, okay. And back there? Winter jacket. Winter jacket. We can go to the slide now. The reason I say this is that in Florida, to this day, theft over $300 is a felony. In Chicago, theft over $300 is a felony. In Virginia, up until last year, theft over $200 was a felony. In Oklahoma, up until 2001, theft over $50 was a felony. When people think about the way the system actually works in people's lives, they often don't think about some of the nuanced and nitty-gritty ways. But we are always mindful that we're fighting at the system level. That in Florida, up until this year, when you became a felon, you permanently lost the right to vote. As you probably know, that got overturned in the sense that felons now have the right to vote, which is a big win. But in Florida, to this day, when you're a felon, you can never run for public office. And if I had asked you to think about what a felon was, you would have said something like murder arson. You wouldn't have said somebody who stole a KitchenAid mixer. You wouldn't have said somebody who stole a wall hanging. You wouldn't have said somebody around some loan payments. You know, people often don't think about the way the system impacts our lives. The next thing I'll ask you to do is, I'll talk about violent crime for a small minute, is what percentage of arrests do you think happen for violent crime? So if you think more than 50% of the arrests that happen are for violent crime, raise your hand. If you think, this is not a trick question, if you think in between 40 and 50% of the arrests that happen in the country are for violent crime, raise your hand. You have to raise your hand at some point. Okay. 30 and 40%. In between 20 and 30%. 10 to 20%. I always get nervous doing this because I was a math teacher. I was not a calculator, and sometimes I'm like, get the numbers right. 5 to 10%. Less than 5%. It is 5%. And it's fascinating because when people think about violent crime, they often think about these like, they think the whole country's falling apart. And the reality is if you think about 5% is arrests, then less than 5% is actually convictions. And again, I say that because it's the way we tell the story about the way the system works, is that when I talk about this idea that we never let the system off the hook, I'm mindful that programs are really important and we should have programs. But the reality is that most of the programs exist because the system failed in the first place. So the reason why we need 1 million after-school programs to teach kids how to read is because they didn't learn how to read during the school day. The reason why we need to feed the homeless who are homeless is because they're homeless. We could actually guarantee people housing. So when we think about the way the system works, always mindful to look at the nitty-gritty ways. The next thing, I'll need a volunteer to help me read the next slide. So whoever can like project, I think there might be a mic. I didn't tell them I was going to do this, so they're going to kill me. But can I volunteer? So the next slide, if you can stand up and read it out loud. I do have a clicker. Okay.
Police union contracts and state laws. Verbal disciplinary warnings and disciplinary written reprimands shall be removed from a police officer's record after 6 months, but all other disciplinary actions or penalties will be removed after 2 years from the date the discipline was administered.
Literally just copied and pasted this out of the police union contract, didn't paraphrase it. That is actually what it says. The next one, can I get a volunteer to read the next one? Right here? Yeah, you. Here we go.
If the city has reason to reprimand or discipline an officer, it shall be done in a manner that is least likely to embarrass the officer or other officers or the public.
That is actually just what it says. I met with the chief of police in Portland. She was just on the job for 5 months. And I think she thought that I was coming into battle. So like she was like ready. And I was like, I just want to talk about a couple clauses in the contract. I talk about this clause. She looks at me like I'm being dramatic because she hadn't seen it before. And then she pulls out her copy and she's like, oh my God, it does say that. And I'm like, oh my God, it does say that. And she is actually being grieved right now by the police union because the police did something bad, and she publicly said it was bad, and they're actually grieving her and the mayor and 2 city council members because of this clause, because they said they felt embarrassed by her public statements. And again, I say that because these are parts of the system that people don't think about. That so much of our work as organizers is like, how do we actually change the outcomes? I spend most of my work on police and mass incarceration, and I'll tell you, for all the work that the protests have done, which is incredible, the outcomes actually have remained pretty flat. The police killed more people in 2018 than 2017. The numbers are flat or getting worse in most cities, and definitely at the national. And I want to be mindful that too often we confuse changing the conversation with changing the outcomes. That we can change the conversation pretty quickly and pretty easily sometimes. That is not always the same thing as changing the outcomes. It's why I'm obsessed with the idea of like, how do we talk about the systemic levers in a way that actually makes sense? Most of the solutions that'll change the outcomes aren't sexy, haven't seen them on the news, probably don't know the ins and outs, but part of our work is to have the curiosity to think about like what the systemic things are that'll change the outcomes. The next thing I'll say is this idea of entrances and on-ramps. So we spend so much of our time trying to get people into the work that we're doing. I think about my aunt as like my goal, that if I can't explain it to my aunt, then it doesn't matter. And not because my aunt is stupid, but my aunt just isn't watching CNN all day. That's just not her life. So when the Kavanaugh hearings were happening, I was trying to figure out how to talk to her. And I knew that like saying Roe v. Wade just wasn't a good hook because she would be like, okay. So I said on Mink, Mink, they trying to hide the papers from us. She's like, what you mean? I'm like, there were some papers in the White House. They trying to hide the papers. She was like, they hiding the papers? I'm like, girl, they hiding the papers. It is bad. They hiding the papers. So once I got her on hiding the papers, then I was like, hey, he don't even believe in a woman's right to choose. She's like, he don't. I'm like, girl, it's bad. Like, he just don't believe. But I say that because so much of our work is to remember to not be so arrogant to believe that the only way to enter is the way we enter. And there are a lot of us, because we're right about the issues, like we're right about healthcare, we're right about diversity and inclusion, we're right about voting, like we're right on the issue, that we believe if people don't come in from a justice perspective or a race perspective, then like they don't actually get to be in the space. Again, I spend most of my time around policing, and there's some rooms I can walk in and say, we can live in a world without police. A lot of rooms I can't, they just can't hear me that way. We did this really cool project in Austin with the organizers there, and a lot of people's like sort of pushes were around fairness. It actually wasn't about race, wasn't about justice. They were like, we think clauses like the one you see here, they were like, we just don't think that's fair. And it's like, cool. Whatever your entrance is, I'm okay with that, because I know that once I get you in, I can take you places, but if I don't get you in, I can't take you anywhere. And that is about being crafty with the entrance. That too often we like lose our craftiness with the entrance because we think our moral compass is enough of an entrance. The next thing I'll say too is about how do we share the cognitive burden. That you've probably been in a room where you make a statement, somebody disagrees, you make a better statement, they're like, no. You give like the speech of a lifetime and they are unmoved. And like that just is, after a while you're tired of that. So I'm mindful that like we want to share the cognitive burden, that we want the person across from us to do as much thinking work as we've done. I was on a panel once with a police officer, and she said to me, DeRay, you saying an officer should never kill somebody? And I paused and I said to her, well, when should an officer kill your child? Like, what's a mistake that your kid can make that you be okay with the bullet between his eyes? And she was like, I don't know. I'm like, well, I don't know either then, right? Like, if you don't know, I don't know. But like, I want you to actually have to do some of the work too. That when I talk to people about welfare now, I'm no longer talking about the dignity of people and food. I'm saying, tell me what a 4-year-old has to do to earn dinner. Like, what does a 7-year-old have to do to be worthy of shelter? I want you to tell me. And like so much of our work, in addition to creating the entrances and on-ramps, is actually sharing the cognitive space so that we're not always on the defense about these positions that we're morally right on, that we're actually having people across the aisle, people who might disagree, or people who want to be with us, we're having them do some of the work too. The fourth thing is this idea of truth and reconciliation. That you've heard about truth and reconciliation. I'm not introducing that to you for the first time here, but what I am saying is a reminder that the truth has to come before the reconciliation. And there are a lot of people who want to do all the reconciliation work without doing any of the truth work. And that doesn't work. I was at a party once, and it was a wearable art party, so we all were wearing these things. And I had like a white, I had a clear like coat thing over an outfit that looked just like this. It was just like a clear jacket. And the jacket had four facts on it. One was that we arrest more people for weed than all violent crimes combined, which is true. The other one was that a third of all the people killed by strangers actually killed by a police officer. That is true. And then one of the ones down here is that white high school dropouts have more wealth than black college graduates, which is true. So this, the guy comes up to me, he sees the wealth one, and he goes, is that true? And I say, yeah. And he's like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, I don't know if you get not to know. Like, it's a fact. Like, it is what it is. And he says to me, well, DeRay, the reason that white people have more wealth is that there are more white people. And I was like, I don't know. But we're at this party, so I can only be butts. I'm like, oh my, what is happening? And I say, the only reason there are more white people is that you killed half the people and enslaved the other half. And he was like, and I'm like, you don't get to not know that. Like, that just is it. But I say that because it's interesting, when we talk about most of the social ills, a lot of people are like ready to engage you on the how do we just move on without actually dealing with the how we got here. And in that moment, it was a like reminder that we like gave white people wealth, We actually did. That like only in this moment we talk about the wealth gap, and the wealth gap is projected to be, the median wealth for black people by 2053 is projected to be $0, the lowest recorded wealth post-slavery, which is sort of wild, and the gap is big. But when you talk to people about solutions, they're like, well, you should be a small business owner. It's like, I shouldn't have to have 4 small businesses to eat dinner. Like we shouldn't have to do that. But when we think about what we did for white people, it's like we literally gave them free housing loans with 1% interest. We like gave people free education. But the idea of direct transfer all of a sudden just doesn't apply to people of color and poor people. That we're like, people's imagination suddenly disappears when we think about the most marginalized. And part of our work is to force people to imagine again. That so much of what it means to grow up on the margin is to like not be seen and heard. And part of our work is to force people to like see and hear a reality and a possibility that we've imagined for other people in these spaces. And like that has to be real. So in that room, I was pushing him about like, let's talk about the truth about how we got here and then let's do the reconciliation work. We can't do the reconciliation work if you're unwilling to engage the truth about where we are. The last thing I'll say is this idea that it's all connected. I think this is the next slide, if I did this right. So most people know Flint because of the lead. There are a lot of things on lead. I'm obsessed with lead. What people don't think about Flint is that it is also a matter of educational justice. So Flint has had the single biggest decrease in childhood literacy that we've ever recorded, a 75% decrease in childhood literacy over 5 years, which is wild. Most people think about it solely because of the water and the environmental and health impacts. People don't think about the educational impacts. And almost all of the issues that we face are connected to something else. We rarely enter into spaces where there's just like a one issue space. Does anybody know why kids ate lead paint chips? So there was like a decade where we were demonizing moms in public housing for their kids eating paint chips. Does anybody know why kids were eating lead paint chips? Not because they're hungry. It tastes good-ish. Anybody? So lead is naturally sweet, which is why kids were eating it. And if any of you have ever been around a toddler, you know that they'll eat anything, let alone if the wall tastes like candy, they're definitely eating the wall. And that is important because for a decade, the Housing Administration was actually mandating that the paint in housing projects be lead-based paint. And it's like when you think about the connectedness of all these issues, it is like a real reminder that we have a lot of work to do at the system level. When we think about closing the wealth gap, it's interesting. People talk about some of the solutions that come to mind. People talk about K-12. What's interesting about K-12 is that K-12 has no impact on the wealth gap because the positive impact of education is almost wiped out because of racism in and of itself. Like ban the box. Raise your hand if you've heard of ban the box. So a lot of people heard of ban the box. Ban the box was a set of laws that passed across the country that said on the first step of the hiring application, they couldn't ask you if you've been convicted of a felony before, a criminal offense. And that is a good thing. It is good policy. Now, what's interesting about ban the box is that the first research that came out after ban the box showed that black people did worse in the workplace than before. Does anybody know why, or can you guess why black people would have done worse in the workplace after ban the box had actually successfully passed? Yeah, because people just assumed that all the black people were criminals because they couldn't actually check anything off on the box, which is sort of wild. And it's a reminder that sometimes the best policy actually just runs up against straight up racism. And like we actually have to do the system and structures piece and the values and beliefs piece at once, that it has to be a both and. But what's interesting about things like the wealth gap is that some of the solutions that people don't think about actually have the biggest impact. So DC went to full day pre-K in 2009 almost solely for educational benefits. Like we should put kids in full day pre-K. If any of you have been parents, you know that half day pre-K that ends at noon is sort of a logistical nightmare. I don't know who thought that was a great idea, but DC went to full day pre-K. And what full day pre-K did in DC is that it led to the highest maternal employment in the country and in the history of DC. And it makes total sense that like mothers now don't have to like stop at noon and pick up their kids. Like that makes a lot of sense. And those are some of the solutions that we have to think about when we're trying to figure out like how do we fix the system. That some of the things that'll have the biggest impact actually aren't like the most obvious. It's things like who thought that full day pre-K would have such a big impact on wealth, on employment for women. Like how do we think about those things? And it is a reminder that all of the work that we do is connected. And part of our work is to figure out what those connections are and help bring as many people into the fold as possible. It's an honor to be here, excited for the next conversation.
Before we get into some of these weighty things, I need to ask you a really important question. And it's about the issue of your vest. Now, I'm a fashion reporter, so I'm very interested in symbols and the things that we wear. And your vest has its own Twitter account, so it's definitely...
I did not start the Twitter account.
It's definitely something that people are thinking about. But it's also a product that's made by Patagonia. And this weekend we've been thinking a lot about people's purchasing decisions and how that can engage people in a conversation, and how that can actually represent something about somebody's values. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you think about the things that you're buying and the brands that you're engaging with, particularly now that you have a platform and people will create an account for your vest, right? So what do those decisions mean to you?
Yeah, Patagonia is an easy company to support, thank God. It'd be harder if I wore a vest and it was a company that was awful, but Patagonia luckily stands by their beliefs and values. I'm not sponsored by Patagonia, which I feel like I always have to say in every room. It's like, I just like them. I bought this a long time ago. I wear it because it reminds me that everything that we went through was real, and that keeps me grounded. I have one vest. People think I have a closet of them. I just have one. It needs to get washed. It's like a little special. I look at it in pictures, and it looks so much better in pictures than it does in real life, but it's good. One of the things that I think about with my buying is that I just don't need as much as I thought I did, It's
Amen to that.
So that is big. Also, there are a lot of interesting things. There's new research on the consumption of fast food that's interesting from the CDC that shows that the consumption of fast food actually increases as income increases, which is counterintuitive for a lot of people. Fascinated by the way we think about what people buy and the psychology of it. And I think about something we covered on the pod recently about the dollar store actually boxing out more mom and pop shops than Walmart, which is a fascinating thing too. So I'm interested as an organizer in how do we look at the unlikely spaces for some of the solutions? How do we sort of ask the questions that get us to different places than we would have gotten to? And as a person, I sort of wear the same thing every day, so it's easy as a consumer. I'm like, you know what? I wear a button-down shirt from Uniqlo. Hope they haven't done anything bad. I wear some track pants and some Adidas. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, for sure. So another big theme of this weekend has been intersectionality, which is it's a word that's been coming up a lot in activist circles. I'm sure it's been for a long time, but it's something that's come up a lot this weekend. And so, as we've been talking this weekend, there's so many ways that all these issues that we're so passionate about are connected. And you've brought some of this up in your own conversation today, your own talk today. How do you stay focused on the issues that you're interested in while also connecting them to larger issues? How do you prioritize? How do you make sense of your everyday work when you realize that there's a web of issues, and whatever it is that you're dealing with at the time is going to be connected to these other issues? How does that work on an everyday basis?
I think that for me, it's starting out with the biggest question. I think that So I'll start here. I used to be the chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore, so I managed everything to do with adults. That was sort of what I did in Baltimore. I taught in New York, but did this work in Baltimore. And I was in charge of all hiring for all positions, including teachers. So the first day of school that year, this was 2 years ago, first day of school, I get an email from a mom, or the superintendent gets an email from a mom that says, my kid is in a kindergarten class with 40 students. Superintendent sends it to me. She's like, DeRay, is there anything you can do to break this class up, because 40 kids is a lot of kids in any class, let alone kindergartners. And kindergartners are old. People think about kindergartners as babies. Kindergartners 5 years old. 5 years is a full person. They're real people, 40 of them. And so I get this email, and literally because this one mom sent an email, I found a teacher, split the class. I found money for the teacher because the school couldn't afford it. And she will never know that she is the only reason why we even knew that the class had 40 kids. The principal didn't tell me, assistant principal didn't tell me. I have a staff member who's assigned to the school. I didn't hear from them. It was this random parent email. And I say that because the system isn't set up to give people feedback that they actually matter. The system isn't designed to say your one random phone call or email actually led to this thing. But I'm always mindful that the one random thing can ripple in ways that people don't ever think about. So when I think about what this work is, when I think about what we have to be mindful of is how do we figure out the things that could ripple? So to this question of how do I do it in my own life, I'm obsessed with sort of big issues around policing, mass incarceration, the wealth gap, those sort of big issues. And then I try to follow my curiosity is that I think people see they see you on TV doing an interview or something, they think that like it always was like that, where literally I'm spending most of my time like reading through these obscure police union contracts in the middle of the night, texting Sam, being like, did you see the discipline matrix in Portland? And he's like, oh my God, I saw that. I'm like, this is crazy. You know, like we literally are like following our curiosity as far as it possibly can go until we can figure out what would be the right lever. And I think at this point, we're like obsessed with the system stuff. So we think about the system as a house built with Legos, and the goal will never be to take each brick one by one. That'll take too long. We're trying to figure out how to take like that one Lego piece that'll make the whole wall fall. And we spend a lot of time trying to find like that Lego piece, you know? So the police union contracts is that Lego piece for us with policing. That in places like California, the law says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline. We think that's crazy. In Maryland, the law says that you can file an anonymous complaint against a police officer for everything except brutality. We think that that's great. You know, like, it's like, how do we figure out these like big levers? With lead, it was like, there's no cure for lead. I think a lot of people don't realize there's no cure for lead. So in Baltimore, for instance, Freddie Gray was a kid who was impacted by lead. We are in Baltimore, the school system is one of the biggest users of the taxis in Baltimore because our special ed is so big that we put our special ed kids and homeless kids in single occupancy taxis in the morning, which is sort of a wild thing. And it's like, how do we actually just like start to look at all these unlikely spaces? And I'm obsessed with the unlikely. Like, how do we look at those?
Yeah, and so some of the big issues that have come out of this weekend, you know, we've been thinking about workers' rights all over the world. But you know, as you've looked at all of this domestically, what can you tell us a little bit about? So, you know, coming back to this question of intersectionality, I mean, what are you seeing here about how workers' rights are being affected by some of these systemic issues here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that you know, I was both a union rep when I was a teacher, and I worked on the district side, like implementing the contract. So I've seen it like on both ends. And I'm always mindful that like you're smart enough to be in all the conversations. That like when I talk about felony theft, people are like, DeRay, is it tied to inflation? I'm like, no, it's like some random people just made up $300. There's like no, it's not like a study that did it. It's not like some crazy, it's not like the cost of a car divided by 10 times inflation minus 2. You know, it's like literally some random people made it up. And you'd be shocked. You sit in a lot of rooms with people, especially in the worker space, people who are organizing but don't have titles as like union organizers or whatever, and they just don't think they're smart enough to participate in the conversation, or they believe that the people across from them must have done this incredible research, and you're like, not the case. You know, like there are a lot of people who need to be pushed in these spaces, and they are not being pushed because they have a title that disallows them from being pushed. So that's like something that I take really seriously. The second is when we think about some of the research that is out there, it's like you should still push on that too. So there's like some really incredible, there's some research that changed industry. So like if any of you work in education, you might have heard about the word gap, like that kids of color are exposed to like 1 million less words than kids in affluent communities, is that study has been debunked a gazillion times. But it literally changed public education when it came out. That like we started doing all these literacy things about exposing poor kids to words, and like the study just wasn't rigorous and has been invalidated 1 million times, but it still traveled a long way. And people just didn't push on it because it was like a study. You're like, well, what if it's wrong? You know, like we actually should push and push and push. Like we shouldn't stop pushing. If you've ever heard, raise your hand if you've heard of the 48-hour rule with police, that the police can wait 48 hours before they give a statement if they've done something wrong. So there's a rule that says the police can wait 48 hours before they can be interrogated in almost every city in the country. And you're like, well, where did the 48-hour rule come from? And it came from this one guy who is a scientist, who his research says that police are the only workers in the country whose memory gets better over time. So they should get 2 days before they're asked any question because the adrenaline will decrease and their memory alone will get better. And that doesn't apply to any other group of employees. You're like, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard. But it has gone unchallenged because he's like a scientist. And like, you can imagine all the work that impacts the things that you do that like, people sort of just take as fact because like the research thing said it. And like, we actually have to be comfortable like pushing and pushing and pushing as much as possible and not letting down the fight.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that that study's been debunked. I have a 3-year-old, and we will do anything to read those like 5 books to her every day, and it is exhausting. So maybe we'll bring it down to like 3 or 2 sometimes, you know, if we need the sleep.
Well, I will say so if you have a 3-year-old, the biggest thing about younger kids, so the single biggest predictor of a kid's reading level is actually their mother's reading level.
Oh.
It's a good thing.
I know how to read, so I think I'm okay.
And parents like don't realize, and this is sort of a tangent, but parents don't realize that like it's a real skill to open a book, like to hold a book and open it is actually a skill. And like anybody can teach kids how to do those sort of things. And what reading to kids really early does is like it helps them hear what fluent reading actually sounds like. It's why we don't want people who aren't good readers to read to kids, because it's not like just like being around words is a good thing. It's like they actually need to hear words spoken fluently. So keep reading.
Okay, I will. But just to follow that thread a little bit. So what are the strategies that, you know, that more thoughtful educators are saying about what to, you know, how to encourage literacy among, you know, different communities? What are the better strategies?
You know, I spent a lot of time with teachers. I used to train teachers in Baltimore, and new teachers will ask me like, how do I teach justice in school? And I'm like, you should just be a good teacher first, right? That like, you know, I go into classes and they're doing like a lesson on, I don't know, apartheid or something, and nobody can read, and you're like, that's not a win, right? That like, you're sort of doing this interesting, cool thing, and like your students actually don't have the core skills, and like the core skills actually sets people up to do all the other stuff. So like I'm mindful of that. With the literacy work at the early ages, it really is like an exposure to fluent reading. So, you know, I have friends who aren't fluent readers, and their partners like very sneakily make sure they don't ever read to the kids because like, you're not a fluent reader. So fluent reading is a big deal. We actually don't have any scaled solutions for adult literacy in the country. So if you're like a 21-year-old that reads picture books, like if you read on a first grade level, we don't have scaled solutions for that, which is like a real problem because they have kids, and we actually like spiral the literacy problem. And we think about, for people of color specifically, it's like, what does it mean that you can probably trace back when people started reading in your family? Like I'm a 3rd generation reader. My great grandmother could only sign her name. And that's sort of a wild thing, that we actually live in a world where there are people who are like 2nd generation readers, you know? Yeah. And like what that actually means for like how you come home, how you interact in the world, how you think about storytelling actually matters a lot.
Yeah, my grandmother couldn't read either, so it's amazing how quickly things can change, but also how crazy that is that...
You're a 2nd generation reader, you know?
Yeah, and I went to college and grad school and all of that. It's wild. Change can happen quickly.
Yes.
So, you know, we've been thinking a lot about how different movements around the world are interconnected. And I know that you think a lot about what's going on here. How are you inspired by things happening outside of this country? And how are you trying to help, you know, other movements as well? How does that all work for you?
Yeah, the reason that I focus a lot on the US is because I think it's very American to like take the learnings everywhere else when you actually haven't fixed the problem. And the reality is that like,
colonialism.
Yeah, it's like, so people are like, Drake, you come talk. It's like, I don't know, the police still killing people here. What am I gonna tell you? I can tell you how to tell a good story because like we figured out the conversation piece. You know, like we actually haven't fixed it here, so I'm mindful of that. And I try not to be like so arrogant to believe that because we have told a good story here, that'll change the outcome somewhere else. You know, when I think about some of the stuff across the country, I spent some time in London working on some of these issues, and it helped me think about like what it is like to be in places with borders that are very different. So, you know, when we talked to the activists in the UK, they would say like, you know, because we would say, well, the numbers look like the police aren't killing people. And they would say, well, yeah, because most of it's happening by border patrol, not like domestically inside the country. And like, we just weren't thinking about that in that way. Here in America, border patrol is actually the single biggest police department in the country. There are 18,000 police departments, but border patrol is the single biggest force in the United States, which is sort of interesting. But being in other places has helped me ask different questions and just like be like, oh, I never thought about the way trauma looks like this, or like I never thought about what it means to organize in a place where there aren't street names, right? Or organize in a community where there aren't house numbers, right? And like, how do you actually figure out how to do it? If anything, it's reminded me that most of us actually have the core organizing skills already. They didn't need to go to 15-hour organizing trainings. They didn't have to do 300 weekends in somebody else's city. That like, they actually knew how to move groups of people from point A to point B. They figured it out. They knew how to tell stories in ways that like mobilize people. That the best of what we do as organizers is like help people refine those skills. I often think about being a teacher And like what I was mindful of when I walked into the classroom is that the gift existed before I got there, that they already had talent. What I was supposed to do is help them find that gift long after I was gone. And that's the same thing as a good organizer. The good organizer says like, you already had the magic before I walked into the room. I'm trying to help you find that magic long after I'm gone. And like being in other places, I think, especially places with less resources, I've seen them be better at the like, you had the magic already. Let me help you like access that magic long after I'm gone.
Yeah. So it gives you perspective and new ideas in lots of ways.
I was just in Haiti too, and these are like wonky system things, but like I didn't know that the Haitian goud is actually printed in the United States. Like it never occurred to me that the currency for other countries might be printed somewhere else. Like that was sort of a fascinating thing to think about. And even, I spent time in rural Haiti, is that only 20% of the teachers are trained in Haiti. So I was there with like a teacher training program, and 80% of the schools are private, like private in the sense that they require tuition and aren't run by the government. And it was like fascinating to see like what that actually does to the way people experience an education system, and to see their reverence for the Haitian Revolution, that like everybody understood it. Like I spoke to some fifth graders and they like had their favorite revolutionary, they understood why, like that was sort of incredible. And also was most recently in South Africa and went to the Apartheid Museum. And what was interesting about the Apartheid Museum, if any of you have not gone or gone, was the way that like revolution is and is not included in the story that people tell about apartheid. So it was like a lot of the ANC, and then it was a lot of the horrors of apartheid, but the middle, which is like Soweto or like the uprisings, like that's actually a pretty small part of the experience in the museum. And it reminded me that like we actually will be the people that tell the story of resistance and revolution. That people, it's easy to tell the story of all the stuff that came after. It is easy to tell the story of the horrors of the stuff that like caused the revolution. People get nervous about the idea of uprisings and telling that story and its complexity, so we smash it and we flatten it. But we will only learn how to do this again if we actually tell those full stories. And I think that there's some other countries that do, that museum was not a good example of it, but I've seen like examples of people like telling better stories of resistance and uprising, and I'm interested in that for like long-term organizing.
Yeah, well, that actually brings me to the next line of questions I had, and you mentioned this before, that so we're talking to a room full of activists who are at the very early stages of their careers as activists. And so that raises so many interesting questions. So one of them is that, we're at this really interesting time in American history. There's so many issues that are rising to the surface, issues involving gender, issues involving the LGBT community, issues involving race, obviously. So how would you advise young people who are thinking about getting engaged? They only have so many resources they can spend, between sort of throwing themselves into these immediate issues that that involve like immediate protests, going out and trying to fix things right now, versus these longer term objectives that you're talking about. How do you help them balance that in their own thinking?
I think the right now helps you set up for later. That like it's hard to organize around something you don't know. And there are a lot of people who are like, DeRay, I want to do something around police. And I'm like, well, what about the police? They're like, police. And I'm like, well, what? They're like, and you're like, that's not helpful. They're like, mass incarceration is bad. I'm like, what's bad about it? They're like, it's bad. And you're like, that actually that's not helpful. And what I'd say is that like find the thing in whatever area you're most passionate about and like learn enough about it, because when you learn one part of a system well, you actually can take that and just expand it. Like systems institutions all operate in similar ways. So when you understand one part of the puzzle well, you actually can take that and expand it. But there are people who like don't understand any part of a puzzle well, and it's just like hard to do the work. So I'd say like start where you are. I'm mindful that most of the good organizing you've ever seen starts really small. The first thing I ever did in St. Louis was make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I made amazing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I made a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. You didn't see pictures of that, but that is like what we spent a lot of time doing, like handing out water, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That people think that it has to start with 400 people, 2,000 people, some big thing. But most organizing starts out in living rooms. It starts out in like common areas. It starts out at like tables like this where people are like, oh, I think we can do something. And like that actually really matters. I'd also say like write down your questions. That like, I've been in so many rooms where people are afraid to ask the question because they're like, I'm not smart enough, I'm too young, I don't know, da da da. The people we're up against are asking for the moon and back. They are asking for everything. And you are not asking for it because like you're like, oh, I don't know if we can get it. Whereas like the other side is like, I think that we're gonna rewrite the tax code overnight, nobody's gonna read it, and we're gonna pass it. You know, like they are dreaming these wild dreams that actually aren't helpful to people. And sometimes we limit ourselves from the dream because we understand constraints really well. And one of the reasons that we understand constraints is almost as a matter of survival. Like we know how long $20 can go. We ain't got a lot of money. Like we know constraints well. But sometimes we have to suspend that intimate knowledge of constraints to like dream the biggest dream and like fight for that. And like sometimes I worry that we don't ask the biggest question in the work, in the room.
And related to that, there's this interesting dynamic that happens with young people, which is that, you know, older generations, institutions, schools, everybody's encouraging us to go out and do great things, you know, until we actually start doing them. And then we get all this backlash. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this right now around, you know, some of the newest congresswomen, for instance, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other people who have, you know, finally, you know, done what everybody told them to do, which is like go out there and make a difference. And then once they're there, they find themselves so constrained, and people are constantly telling them that being young is a liability, that you don't know enough, right? Have you dealt with that in your own life as a young activist? And also, how do you respond to that?
You know, I interviewed AOC on the podcast like before she'd actually got sworn in. She won, but hadn't gotten sworn in yet. And I asked her, you know, people feel like there are a lot of people who criticize you who think that you should have run as an independent, like why'd you run as a Democrat? And what's your relationship with the party, given your criticisms of the party? And she looked at me and she said, my relationship with the party is fine, because I understand the party is every door I knocked on, is every single mom, is every parent, is every teacher. Like my relationship with those people, with my constituents, is perfect. I never confuse the people who have those positions as the party. The party is like everybody whose door I knocked on. And I was like, that is brilliant, right? And I think what she has modeled for people is that like if you maintain a connection with people, then like all the other stuff can just sort of dissolve. I think what she's also modeled is that when you know your work, you know your work. And you know, I think about I was the chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore at 31. I was the youngest chief in the history of the school system. And I got a lot of pushback and stuff like that, but what you couldn't say was that I didn't know human capital. I knew it well, you know, and I could go toe to toe with anybody in the space. And that took like following the curiosity all the way out. And what I'd say to activists and organizers, and what I do say when we go and help train people or like develop people's skills, is like you actually just have to know the work really well. So when you go in the room, you can go toe to toe. And sometimes I think that people get lulled into this belief that that moral fortitude is all the work you have to have, and that's just not enough. So when you go to a room about the minimum wage or like a law you're trying to change and you just haven't thought fully about it, then like that's just not great, you know? And you actually are smart enough to go toe to toe with the people who are setting policy. It's not like you're up against savants in every city. That is not what's happening, you know? And I'm always shocked. I think about that clause with the police union contract, with the police chief in Portland, Oregon, is that she actually just wasn't ready to talk about it because she hadn't done the work yet. And so as sitting in the room, I was the expert and she wasn't on her own contract. And like that took a lot of preparation, but we did it. And I've seen activists walk into rooms, be so prepared that it's just you're like, yes, this is what it's supposed to be. So I think that's how we combat it. I think it's real that a lot of people want to be your parents, not your peers, you know? People are like, I've worked my whole life for it. I did it. How you just coming out? And it's like, if you worked so hard, then like, well, I shouldn't have to be here. I don't want to do this. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would love to go back to what I was doing before. I'm doing this because like, again, the outcomes actually haven't changed. So once we change the outcomes, then like, I'll go back to doing what I was doing before. But like, you're not like encouraging me by being like, I've been here forever. I'm like, I know, that's the problem, you know?
Yeah. And I think another thing that's coming out of this interesting time that we're in is, so there's a lot of, you know, there are a lot of issues to be fighting for right now. And a lot of people in this room are doing that, you know, work on the ground. But a lot of this is, you know, there's also a lot of evidence that things are just not changing, right? Like we, you know, with the current president and with, you know, a lot of the different issues that keep coming up, it's like we're hearing the same things over and over and over again. The same questions about race, the same questions about gender. They just keep coming up. So what words do you have for young people who don't even know if they should be getting involved in these fights because like what difference has it made in the past, right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm like, not to be Debbie Downer, but I am like intense about the outcomes, and like we got to be honest about like what is changing and what's not changing. I think there are a lot of local wins that are happening across the country, and that's a good thing. I think too that like the way to change the system at scale, it really is some of the unlikely things. So I'll ask you, how many people does ICE detain a day? Do you know how many people does ICE detain a day?
50?
50 people?
Yeah.
ICE?
Yeah.
Okay. More than that.
It's a lot more than that on the
It's
board.
44,000. So ICE detains 44,000. Yeah. 50. I'm like, 50 what?
On the border?
So ICE is, Border Patrol arrests people on the border. ICE arrests people who have violated immigration.
Around the country.
Yep. So ICE detains 44,000 people a day. ICE doesn't own enough property to detain that many people. So the question is like, where do they detain the people if it's not the tents that you saw on TV? And what's interesting is that ICE actually rents out local prisons and jails. So what people have started to do that is like a fantastic organizing idea is like actually work with their city council to void the contract that allows them to put people in your local prison and jail. And it's those sort of things that like, ICE is a national agency, it's a national issue. People have been trying to figure out like, what can I do at the local level? And it's like, there actually is a fix at the local level, you know? Like that's one, like making sure that your like city police officers like don't send kids to ICE. So their school systems actually that are called, the guidance counselors are calling ICE on kids that they think are in gangs, which is a nightmare. And like, you can actually stop that at the local level. You know, like there are all these things actually that we can do that aren't as sexy that you haven't seen on MSNBC, but actually can have a huge impact on some of the things that you actually care about. So that gives me hope in these moments. I'm mindful there's a difference between saying the system can't change and it hasn't yet. I think that some people confuse it too, that it hasn't changed in the way that we want it to at scale, which doesn't mean that it cannot. And we actually have seen some good wins and some good models for wins at very local levels. The question is like, how do we scale that? Mindful that the system works really, really hard to work against you. But as we know that like the power of the people is always greater than the people in power. Like we believe that as like an organizing principle. And that's why I started with this idea of how do we create entrances and on-ramps, that we are trying to figure out how to build the biggest, like how do we build the biggest choir of people? I say often, you know, people are like, DeRay, you're preaching to the choir. And I'm like, that's cool, I like the choir, sign me up for the choir. That if any of you have ever been in a choir, you know the choir is hard work. There's nothing about being in the choir that's easy. There's rehearsal, there's practice, there's like learning new music, there's the travel. And like, I'm trying to figure out like, how do we make sure that people figure out how to do something with their individual voice with other people that they didn't know that they could do before. And that is what it means to be in the choir, I believe. That being in the choir is also being open to learn new tunes, like how to turn a mumble into a melody, a hum into a hymn, that we're actually trying to help you like transform the way you thought about the world into something else. And like, that is choir work. You think about this last election, more people voted for the Dems in the midterms than voted for Trump total. So the numbers are actually on our side. You know, it's not like we have to reach across the aisle to get the numbers we need. Like the numbers are actually already here. The question is like, can we organize those people? Can we talk to those people in a way that resonates with them? Can we help them see that they are a part of the vision and the world that we all want to live in? Like that is our problem. It's not like, are the people there? The people have always been there.
So I have two more questions for you, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. So if you have your questions for DeRay, please get them ready. So you, on the pod, you have two questions for your guests, and so I'm going to ask them to you this time. So what would you say to people in this room who are working really hard and are speaking up every day and are fighting the good fight, and yet they're not seeing the change that they're looking for, not even the slightest? What words do you have for them?
I do ask this of everybody. I don't think about my answer often, but what I'd say today is two things. One is that like fight like you can get it in your lifetime. I'm sort of tired of people being like, oh, we're gonna fight, and you know, might come in. I want it now. You know, like I want it in this lifetime. I want to see it. And I say that because, again, like the other side is always fighting for things they want in this lifetime, and they get it. You know, like Trump gave $700 billion to the military. That is, it would take 1/7 of that to take every single person out of poverty. So it's never a matter of like, can we do it? It is always a matter of will we do it? And like, I'm mindful of the way the strategy changes if you think that this is like a 200-year solution, as opposed to like, I think we can get it. And like, the question is like, how do we get it in this lifetime? Like, I'm obsessed with that. The second is that like, sometimes we have to live in a little disbelief that like, we know the constraints really well. And sometimes we think about the constraints as permanent as opposed to present. What we need to think about is the constraints are present. People are poor today, doesn't mean they always have to be poor. People are homeless right now, doesn't mean they always have to be homeless. Kids can't read right now, doesn't mean they always can't read. They're like, the presence of constraints doesn't mean the permanence of constraints. And like, that is something that like always sticks with me as an organizer, that like, we gotta like push and live in a little disbelief, because that's how magic happens. And that like, we gotta make space for the magic, that has to be a part of what we do. So that gives me hope. And the third is that I've seen people with no training, with no like formal skills, do the most incredible things. And as an organizer, when we talk about young people, we often say to young people, or about young people, that young people have the experiences before they have the language. And that our goal is to not penalize them for not having the language. We want to get as close to the experience as possible. And I take that with me every day, that I think that the closer we get to the experience that people live, that like we actually will just be better at our work. There are people who live in food deserts in Baltimore who don't have the language of a food desert, which doesn't mean that it's not real. There are people who like are on the margins of the wealth gap, who like don't understand that language, but that doesn't mean that that's not their reality. And like, how do we help bridge the gap between language and experience, but also not penalize people for not having the language? And I think that like we're starting to do that a little bit better. The last thing I'll say is I never confuse proximity to the problem with proximity to the work. Is that people will say things, and I think it's a cool phrase, that they're like, the people closest to the problem should be closest to the solution. It's like a phrase that people say in organizing. But what I'd say is that like, you know, I'm from Baltimore, I live in Baltimore, and there are people who are close to the problem of community violence. They have lost somebody, they themselves have been victims, and they believe that the solution is more police. That's not the solution. But I can't say that those people aren't close to the problem. They are close to the problem. But I want to help sort of tease out the difference between close to the problem and close to the work. Both of my parents were addicted to drugs. My father raised us. My mother left when I was 3, came back when I was 30. That alone doesn't make me an expert on addiction. It does mean that I'm close to the problem. I have to do the work to actually understand the work of addiction a little better to be able to talk about it. And I think people confuse the two things, proximity to the problem as proximity to work. And I want us to like have a better language about proximity to work and a better lived reality about proximity to work.
And the final question is, what piece of advice have you received that has stuck with you?
Yeah, so this is a little bit easier. So my friend, the poet Cleo Wade, is a dear friend. And she has this line in her book that says, not every ground is a battleground. And I love that, because I think I'm so used to fighting that I just got used to, you know, it was just like a battle was the way that I understood relationships. It was like, that's the way I understood boundaries, is that I pushed and pushed until I understood them. And she helped me realize that like the ground is also a space that holds you up and affirms you, that the ground isn't only a space that you battle on. And I take that with me every day. That's
wonderful. Okay, so can we, I'm going to open it up to questions. So who has a question for DeRay? I think somebody's coming around with the, is somebody coming around with the mic? Okay.
I saw him first, yes.
So once again, thank you for coming here. It's amazing. And second of all, so with all of your work in your career, especially being in Ferguson, when do you sometimes learn that you can't necessarily educate some people?
Yeah, this is why I'm like doubling down on the choir. Some people just aren't gonna be in the choir, and I'm okay with that. You know, like, I get it. And like some people don't wanna be, there's some people who can be moved. When my book came out in September, I just signed all these books in a warehouse for 2 days. And one of the guys who was with me, he came back the second day after the first day of signings, like, because we were in a warehouse, and he said, DeRay, my best friend's a police officer, and he did the same thing that police officer said on the panel. He said, are you saying a police officer should never kill anybody? And I knew he had kids because we had talked the day before. I didn't know he was like so right wing about the police. And I said, what's your kid's name? And he said his kid's like 5. And I said, well, what mistake would your kid make that you'd be okay with a police officer putting a bullet between his eyes? And he like paused and he was like, I don't have an answer. And it was like that, like, so there's some people like that who like, I was able to move him in that moment because he was open to the idea. And I also know that people think about protest, they want me to scream and yell. That's like the only way people can think about a protester. So I'm not screaming and yelling, people are like all over the place, right? And like, so there are those people. There are other people though who are just racist, like they are racist. And that's not my work. That might be somebody's work, but like I'm actually not, I don't need to do that. And part of it is like from a numbers perspective, is that like we actually have the numbers on our end. The second is that like those people just waste my time. You know, like I'm exhausted trying to convince them, and I'm actually not building up the people who want to be in the work because I'm like spending all day with the racist grandma who just is racist. Like somebody should help her figure it out. I don't think that has to be my work, but I'm mindful that like I want those people to be free too. I don't want the police to kill those people. I want to see those people in the future that we build. I want them there. I don't want to fight with them as we get there.
There's a question over here.
Hi. So I'm working with some students at Cleveland State to bring Ban the Box there. And we've talked about like the other implications, and I'm wondering at like the Ban the Box level and broader, how do you fight policy and narrative at the same time? And like, do you have any advice on how to do that?
Yeah, so I think that Ban the Box is sort of interesting. I think that it is the right policy. It is the question with Ban the Box, I think, is how do we marry right policy with like straight up racism? And it's one of those things that you've heard about. What's it called? Like the non-bias training or the. No, it's like I'm like so annoyed by it that I forgot the name of it.
Unconscious bias.
Unconscious bias. Oh, yeah, I'm like, I wiped it out. So you've heard about unconscious bias training, and unconscious bias training always annoys me a little bit because like some of the bias is conscious. You know, it's like it was conscious. And us calling everything unconscious is sort of like letting all these people off the hook. And I say that because like naming things as conscious bias is actually a part of the work of like resetting values. When we let people off the hook and everything becomes like, when that woman called the police on those two black guys at Starbucks, that was conscious. Like, I don't know what the unconscious part of that act was, you know what I mean? And I think we let people off the hook on some of the values and belief stuff, and like we can't. So when I think about like the policy stuff around Man in the Box, it's like, we have to fight the right policy and we have to do the values work at the same time. It's why people get upset with voting. It's like, voting is not gonna change everything. Voting is a system thing. Voting changes the structures and systems. Voting doesn't change the values and beliefs. And if you thought that voting changed the values and beliefs, you just had different expectations. That's why you're disappointed in the vote. Not because the vote did anything wrong. You just thought it did more than it does with both of these buckets. The values and beliefs things is like storytelling, right? It's like, it's all those details. So the question of like how, I think that we do remember that every story is a lesson in power. That like, you know, you raise your hand if you've seen Bad Boys, any of the Bad Boys movies? The older people might have. Raise your hand if you've seen Zootopia. I'm always shocked at the number of people who've seen Zootopia. And raise your hand if you've seen Bright. It was on Netflix. It was not very good. Will Smith was in it. Okay, 5 people. I'll start with Zootopia. Is that like when you think about Zootopia and you think about Bad Boys, is that both of those movies are movies where the police literally destroy people's neighborhoods in like the effort to find the bad guy. In Zootopia, which is an animated film, she literally destroys like a miniature community to find the guy with the onion. And you're like, this is like a Disney movie. You know, it's like not a Disney movie, but it's like an animated film. And always mindful that like all the stories that we consume actually are telling a lesson about power. Raise your hand if you remember Bad Bar. Does anyone remember Bad Bar, like the old cartoon Bad Bar? Yeah. It's an old cartoon. There's a book called Should We Burn Bad Bar? And it's about like the way power shows up in children's books, and Bad Bar is particularly a problematic book or storyline. But like people forget that like the value stuff is actually everywhere, and that when we only fight in like meetings, we're losing the battle. That you can't name 1, 2, 3 TV shows or movies where you've seen internal affairs in a police department not be the bad guys, the throwaway cops, the people that nobody likes. Like that actually is communicating a lesson in power, and like that has to be a part of our work to fight too. But Ban the Box is good policy. It's like people are racist and we actually have to fight that.
Bad Bar was kind of a racist elephant, wasn't he?
Yeah, Bad Bar, not to go down a lane about Bad Bar because not a lot of people remember Bad Bar, but the only reason that Bad Bar has claim to the land that he is in is that he actually left and got raised by humans and then came back. Bad Bar is an elephant. So like just in the way he's like legitimized is this idea that like you can't be a leader in your space if you stay in your space. Like you actually have to be validated by white people somewhere else to even be able to lead is like sort of the first problem with Bad Bar. And then the way women are represented is a real problem. It's just like a Bad Bar, but it's like an adorable story. And then you're like, it's a problem.
Don't want to even get you started talking about Tintin, because that's like a whole other thing. Another question over here, yeah.
Sure, thank you. So I think it's wonderful that you're using your podcast to facilitate such important, much needed dialogue. It's definitely helped me see the world through a lens that's not my own. So I'm curious, about why you chose that as your platform to facilitate those conversations.
Yeah, so I have a big platform on Twitter, and I was worried that people weren't learning on Twitter anymore. That Twitter was becoming either toxic for people, or it was just like a lot of sort of one-way communication. People just like weren't learning. And I believe that if we could model what it was like to learn and listen, then I thought that could be a lever. And like, I love Twitter. Twitter's been great. I've seen the good and bad. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for raising money to try and get me killed. So I've seen that part of Twitter. And I've also seen like the movement building part of Twitter. But the podcast, it's like, because I don't talk to the people I interview before I interview them, like I'm learning too. So like I had Snowden on episode 3, and however you feel about Snowden, we talked about like security and race. And like, he doesn't really talk about the intersection of race and security, his normal stuff, but like, everything he said, I was like, I hadn't heard that before. You know, like, I wanted to learn in those spaces too. We did this episode on, I'm obsessed with the dentist because we didn't go to the dentist as kids because my father raised us, and I love my father, but like water cured everything. And you're like, Daddy, this is not it. So as an adult, I'm like fascinated with dentists. So we had these people around dental justice on, and like I didn't know, parents probably know this, I didn't know, is that not all teeth are baby teeth, which I didn't know. So like when your molars come in, they're permanent. So a lot of parents that don't know that, so kids' molars they come in around 5 or 6. Their molars will rot because people just aren't taking care of their teeth. And parents will think that like, oh, well, the new molars will come, and like new molars don't come. So there's like a set of kids, mostly in low income communities, who actually die or they get serious infections from the molars rotting. So we covered that on the pod. The fix for that is like either take your kids to the dentist or get your kids' teeth sealed. You can put like a sealant on your kids' teeth so like they literally can't get cavities. And it was beautiful. We got these emails from people being like, I got my kids' teeth sealed because of your episode, right? And it's like those sort of things that like we could do on the podcast because people heard us like learn that issue in a way that like Twitter is just like a little different.
Okay, we'll have one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up for the day. So how about over there? Just there. Yep.
Thank you. So my question comes from the standpoint of an ally. So allies is a hot term right now. We're all allies of the LGBTQ community or the Black Lives Matter movement. How can folks who are not part of those communities be the best allies for those communities?
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the ways now that we think about it is like the difference between an ally and an accomplice. That an ally says like, I hope you get free, like, hope you get free. An accomplice says like I'm gonna be with you as we get free, you know, like it's the proximity issue is sort of different. What good allies and accomplices do is that they ask questions. So they say like, how can I help you, right? Like they actually like do that offering as opposed to just walking into the space and be like, I'm gonna do this. Like that actually is not, that's a sign of privilege to walk into somebody else's space and just decide what you're gonna do is actually like privilege on display. So I think asking the question is really important. The second is like, you know, most of the issues around race and justice, people expect me to talk about them, right? The police kill somebody, I get a call, and it's like, I just start saying to people like, you know that's wrong too. You don't need me to say it, right? Like, I can say it, but I've said it a million times. They need to see you saying like, that didn't make sense, right? And then like, how will you use like your public spaces to actually talk about issues that don't directly impact your life, but do impact like a community and world that you want to live in. So like you are impacted by these issues. It's why we push people when we say like 2 million people are incarcerated or da-da. It's like, yeah, those people are incarcerated, but think about the collateral, right? You think about like all the mothers, fathers, cousins who are impacted too. And like you are impacted, right? Like your community is actually impacted in that too. And like people don't think about it in that way. And we push people to say like, will you talk about the things that don't seem like they matter to you in this moment? One of the things that does worry me about Trump, which is like an understatement because everything is sort of a worry about this administration, is that there are a lot of people who really do think the history of injustice began with the Muslim ban. They were like, oh my God, the country's bad. And you're like, country's bad for a lot of people before the Muslim ban. Muslim ban is bad. It has been bad for a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who like right now, like understand their voice as an activist almost solely because he is just so wild that you can't ignore it. And the question becomes, will these people still care when the threat is not so present, right? When he is not the only story on the news every single day, will you still care about like ICE detaining kids and putting them in cage? Like, will people even pay attention? And like, I think that'll be the true test of like what an ally is, will be the day Trump's not in office and like seeing the way either the energy continues or the people are like, what, we fought? And you're like, no, the outcomes are still bad. So that's what I have to offer.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure that everybody here is really psyched to have had a chance to hear from you directly. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.